They called me the 1-minute man in front of 400 guests. My wife stayed silent. As I left, I smiled and said, "Check your bank accounts tomorrow morning." The room went silent the second I walked through those doors. Not the polite, respectful kind of silence. Not the kind where people turn to look because someone important just arrived. It was the other kind, the kind that comes before a laugh. And then the laughing started. I heard it in waves rippling from one side of the ballroom to the other. I saw hands covering mouths, eyes cutting sideways, glasses raised toward faces to hide smirks, and then a woman near the champagne table, someone I'd never seen before in my life, leaned into her friend and said it loud enough for me to hear clearly over the jazz quartet playing in the corner. "Oh my God, is that him? The 1-minute man?" I kept walking. My face didn't move. My breathing stayed even. 22 years of running a company teaches you to absorb a blow without flinching. You learn that the worst thing you can do when someone's trying to break you is show them it's working. But I heard every word, every single one. My name is Bradley Hargrove. I'm 49 years old. I built a logistics and supply chain company from a single warehouse in Columbus, Ohio, into a national operation worth over $138 million. I have 70% ownership. My wife Simone holds the other 30, or she did. That night at the grand opening of Simone's new Chicago branch on the 34th floor of a glass tower on North Michigan Avenue, surrounded by 400 people who were laughing at me, I made a decision, not an emotional one, not a reactive one, the kind of cold, precise decision that you can only make when the anger is so deep it's already gone quiet. I turned around and walked out the way I came in, calmly, without a word. And then I went to work. Before I tell you what happened next, I need to ask you to do something. If you've ever been humiliated by someone who was supposed to love you, if you've ever had to smile while something inside you was burning, drop a comment below. Tell me one word that describes how it feels. I read every single one. And if this story is already pulling you in, hit subscribe and leave a like. So more people find it, because this story, I promise you, is not going where you think it's going. I need to go back to the beginning, not because I want your sympathy. I want you to understand exactly how we got to that ballroom. Simone Hargrove, née Simone Adler, was 26 when I met her. I was 31. She was working as a business development coordinator for a mid-sized freight broker in Cincinnati, and I was there pitching them on a partnership with my then 3-year-old company. She was the one who walked me to the conference room, and when I made my pitch, she was the only person in that room who asked a question that made me pause. She said, "What happens to your clients when you scale too fast and your infrastructure can't keep up?" I looked at her and thought, this woman is sharp. We had dinner 2 days later. We were engaged 14 months after that, and 2 years into our marriage, I made the decision that defined everything that came after. I gave Simone 30% equity in Harrov Logistics, not because I was legally obligated to, not because she pressured me, because I believed in her, because I thought we were partners in every sense of the word, because I was the kind of man who, when he loves someone, goes all in. That's important. Remember that. For the first 8 years, it worked. Simone was genuinely talented. She built our client relations division from nothing. She developed relationships with regional distributors that opened doors I couldn't have knocked on alone. She had a social intelligence I lacked, where I was comfortable in spreadsheets and operations. She was comfortable in rooms full of people, making them trust her almost instantly. We complemented each other. That was the story we told ourselves. That was the story I believed. What I didn't see because I was too busy running the company was when the story started changing. It started 3 years ago, small things first. Simone began pushing for the Chicago expansion aggressively, not just suggesting it, but driving it with a kind of urgency that felt different from her usual strategic thinking. She wanted her own branch, her own team, her own territory. I supported it. Of course I did. I backed her proposal with $32 million in company capital. Then came the late nights. Simone had always worked hard, but this was different. The calls that stopped when I walked into the room, the weekends she spent in Chicago during the build-out while I held things together in Columbus, the way she started talking about her project manager on that Chicago job, a man named Derek Weston, with a familiarity that felt practiced, like she'd learned how to say his name casually. I'm not a suspicious man by nature, but I am an analytical one, I noticed. I filed it away, and I kept working, 6 months before the grand opening. I hired a private consultant to do a routine review of the Chicago branch's financial structure. It was standard practice. I did it with every major operation. But this review came back with something that wasn't standard at all. There were 2 sets of books. Not dramatic, obvious fraud, not the kind of thing a careless person would leave behind. Sophisticated layered adjustments designed to look like normal variance at the macro level. But when you dug in, when you followed the vendor payments through 3 shell entities that shouldn't have existed, you found a pattern. Money was moving. Not a lot at once, but consistently, over 18 months, approximately $4.20, $2 million, had been quietly redirected out of the Chicago build-out budget, and the paper trail, faint as it was, pointed toward 2 people. One of them was Derek Weston, the other was my wife. I sat with that information for 11 days before I did anything. 11 days of going home to Simone, eating dinner with her, asking about her day, listening to her talk about the opening party and the guest list, and the florist who'd gotten the centerpieces wrong. 11 days of watching her lie to my face without knowing I could see through it. I used those 11 days wisely. I called David Ashworth, who has been my attorney for 14 years, and who I trust more than almost anyone alive. I called my accountant, Renee Calder, who is the most methodical human being I've ever worked with, and I called Franklin Briggs, a forensic financial investigator I'd used twice before on due diligence for acquisitions. Together, over those 11 days, we built a case, a thorough, airtight, documented case, every transaction, every shell entity, every timestamp, every electronic signature. We also found something else. Simone had quietly filed paperwork 4 months earlier to reclassify her shares. It was buried in a routine corporate filing, the kind that goes through a law firm and only crosses the founding shareholder's desk if someone's specifically watching. She'd consulted with a corporate attorney about restructuring the ownership in a way that would give her operational control of the Chicago branch as a semi-independent subsidiary. If the filing had proceeded without challenge, she would have effectively created a separate entity that she controlled outright, using $32 million of my capital to do it. She was building an exit, not just from the marriage, from the company. And Derek Weston was the reason. I found the messages by accident. I wasn't looking for them. Franklin was reviewing communications logs on the company server as part of the financial investigation, and there they were. 2 years of correspondence on a company email account that Simone had apparently never thought to lock down, perhaps because she'd been using it so long it felt invisible. I won't describe the content in detail. I'll only say this. Simone told Derek things about me, private things, intimate things, things that a wife learns about a husband over years of marriage and keeps in confidence, as you're supposed to. She shared them with him, and he used them to make her laugh. 2 years of laughing at me in writing. I read the messages once. closed the file, told Franklin to preserve everything, and then I went to the gym for 2 hours because I needed to hit something that wouldn't hit back. Then I went back to planning. The opening party was scheduled for a Saturday night. Simone had been preparing for it for weeks. The venue was the Pinnacle Ballroom at the Meridian Tower on North Michigan Avenue. 400 guests, jazz quartet, champagne tower, the works. She'd spared no expense because she was spending company money, my company money. I decided to attend, not because I wanted to confront her publicly, not because I wanted a scene. I decided to attend because disappearing that night would have been suspicious, and because I had a different kind of plan in motion that required a specific sequence of events. What I didn't anticipate was Derek Weston. I arrived at the Meridian Tower at 7:45. The doorman checked my name against the list, and something flickered across his face that I couldn't read at the time. I know now what it was. He'd been told something about me. The elevator opened onto the 34th floor, and when I walked into that ballroom, I was wearing a charcoal gray suit I'd had made in Milan 5 years ago, and I was completely calm. The room was full and loud and glittering, the kind of event Simone could genuinely execute beautifully. The silence started about 10 seconds after I entered. Not immediate. It spread like a message moving person to person. And then came the laughter. The woman near the champagne table. The whisper that wasn't quite a whisper. The one-minded man. I kept walking. I was looking for Simone. I found her across the room, standing with a cluster of people near the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the lake. She was wearing a red dress I'd never seen before, and she was looking at me with an expression I can only describe as calculating. Not panicked, calculating like she was running a sequence in her head. I was 20 feet from her when Derek Weston stepped in front of me. He was tall, younger than me, maybe 38, wearing a suit that looked like it had been bought specifically for this occasion. He had the confident posture of a man who believed he was currently winning, which, as far as he knew, he was. He put a hand on my chest, not hard, not violent, just the way a man puts a hand on a chest when he wants to stop someone without creating a scene. "Bradley," he said, "I think it's time for you to go." The room around us was watching. "This is a private event," he continued, his voice smooth and just loud enough for the nearest 20 people to hear. "For business associates and stakeholders, I'm afraid you being here is a disruption." He turned to someone I couldn't see and said, "Can someone get security?" Simone was watching from across the room. She didn't move. She didn't say a word. She just watched. I looked at Derek Weston's hand on my chest. Then I looked up at his face, and I said very quietly, so that only he could hear it, "Take your hand off me once." He did. Something in my voice told him to. Then I straightened my jacket. I looked around the room at all those faces watching, some laughing still, some gone silent with something that might have been unease. I looked at Simone, who still hadn't moved, and then I walked toward the elevator. I heard a smattering of laughter as the doors closed behind me. By the time I reached the lobby, I had my phone in my hand, and I called David. "It's time," I said. "I've been waiting." He said, "Everything's in position. Here's what happens when a man with 70% ownership of a 138 million company decides to exercise that ownership in 24 hours. The first call David made was to the company's primary bank, where I had signatory authority on all major accounts. By 8:15 that Saturday night, every discretionary payment attached to the Chicago branch was suspended pending review. The vendor invoices that were scheduled to autopay on Monday morning. The contractor draws the lease escalation Simone had quietly approved without my sign-off. All of it frozen. The second call was to the catering company handling the grand opening party. We had a company account on file with them going back 6 years. The balance due on that evening's event was $412,000, which Simone had planned to run through the company account on Monday. David contacted them and informed them that the company account was under a financial review and that no charges could be processed until further notice. He did this politely with full documentation and suggested they reach out to Simone directly regarding alternative payment arrangements. The third call was to the hotel block. Simone had reserved 14 rooms at the Loews Chicago on East Superior Street for out-of-town guests attending the opening weekend. Corporate account, same result, suspended. The fourth call was the one I'd been thinking about the longest. Simone and I had planned a business trip to Barcelona in 3 weeks, a trip she described to me as a partner relations summit with European distributors. Franklin's investigation had established that Derek Weston was also registered to attend this summit. The travel had been booked through the company travel account. Business class flights, a suite at the Hotel Arts Barcelona on the waterfront, €5,700 for 5 nights. David made the call, both reservations cancelled. By 10:30 that night, while Simone was presumably still in that ballroom on the 34th floor of the Meridian Tower, raising champagne glasses and letting Derek Weston bask in the moment. The financial architecture she'd been building for 2 years had begun to quietly come apart, but the most significant call, the one that everything else depended on, had happened earlier, before the party, 2 days before. I had exercised a shareholder provision I'd had David draft quietly into our corporate agreement 4 years ago, back when the company first crossed $50 million in valuation. It was a clause that allowed the majority shareholder to initiate a valuation review and temporary asset freeze on any subsidiary or division in response to a documented financial irregularity. The irregularity was documented. The clause was triggered. The Chicago branch, as a subsidiary of Hargrove Logistics, was now subject to a full financial review under my authority as majority shareholder. Simone's attempt to spin off the Chicago branch as an independent entity had just hit a wall the size of a federal filing. I drove back to Columbus that night, 4 hours on I-65 South, windows down, the radio off. I needed the quiet. I thought about 14 years of marriage. I thought about a woman who'd once asked me the right question in a conference room in Cincinnati and who I had answered honestly because I thought she deserved the truth. I thought about what it means to go all in on a person and have them spend that investment on something you never agreed to. I didn't cry. I'm not saying that to be tough. I'm saying it because the grief had already happened. Somewhere in those 11 days of watching and building the case, I'd done most of the grieving. What was left felt more like work, like the kind of focused, deliberate work I'd been doing my whole life. I got home at 2:00 in the morning, poured myself 1 glass of bourbon, and went to bed. My phone had 56 missed calls. The first call came at 10:47 Saturday night. Simone. I let it go. The second, 11 minutes later, Derek's number, which I'd had for years because he was a company employee. I let that go. 2. Then more Simone. Then a number I didn't recognize, which turned out to be the catering company's event director, who had apparently just been told the Monday payment wouldn't process and was understandably concerned. Then Simone again. Then a Chicago area code I didn't recognize. Then Simone 4 more times. By 2:00 a.m., when I arrived home, the count was 56. I turned the phone face down on my nightstand and slept for 6 hours. Sunday morning. I made coffee. I sat at my kitchen table, the same table Simone and I had eaten breakfast at for 8 years. And I started returning calls, not Simone's, not Derek's, the vendor calls, the catering company, the hotel. I handled each one professionally. I apologized for the inconvenience. I explained there was a financial review underway. I confirmed that the company's obligations would be addressed through the appropriate channels once the review concluded. Every conversation was courteous. Everyone left that vendor with a clear understanding that if they had questions about payment, they should contact Simone Harov directly. The doorbell rang at 11:47 Sunday morning. I wasn't expecting anyone. I looked through the window before opening the door, and I saw something I hadn't anticipated. It was Simone's father. Robert Adler is 68 years old. He's a retired electrical contractor from Dayton. He's a man who built things with his hands for 40 years, and who has never, in the 14 years I've known him, asked me for anything. He calls me on my birthday. He came to my mother's funeral. He is, in the truest sense, a decent man, and he was standing on my porch holding his car keys, which meant he'd driven 2 hours from Dayton without calling. I opened the door. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he said, "I think you should tell me what happened." I made him coffee. We sat at the same kitchen table, and I told him, not all of it, not the messages, not the details I had no right to share with a father about his daughter, but the financial picture, the shell entities, the $4.2 million, the share restructuring, the filing to spin off the Chicago branch. Robert listened without interrupting. He held his coffee cup with both hands, and he stared at the table while I talked. When I finished, he didn't speak for a long time. Finally, he said, "I'm going to ask you something, and I need a straight answer." "Of course," I said. "Is there any part of this that's wrong, any detail that might not be what it looks like?" "No," I said. "I wish there was." He nodded slowly. "She called me last night. She told me you were trying to destroy her business out of jealousy, that you showed up at the party and made a scene, and then went home and cancelled everything to punish her." I didn't say anything. I told her. Robert said that you weren't the kind of man who made scenes. She didn't have a good answer for that. He set down the coffee cup. "I'm sorry, Bradley. I don't know where I went wrong with her, but I know this isn't on you." I walked him to his car an hour later. He shook my hand. Then he pulled me into a hug that lasted longer than you'd expect from a man who grew up in a generation that didn't hug. I stood in the driveway after he drove away and let myself feel the full weight of it for exactly 60 seconds. Then I went inside and called David. The legal proceedings began Wednesday. David had filed the financial irregularity documentation with the corporate board, which technically consisted of me, Simone, and 2 independent directors we'd brought in 3 years ago, a woman named Patricia Holtz, who ran a supply chain consultancy, and a man named George Faraday, who had 30 years in logistics finance. Both were professional, both were serious, and both reviewed the documentation over the course of 2 days with the gravity it deserved. The board meeting was held in our Columbus office on a Thursday afternoon. Simone arrived with her own attorney, a woman named Caroline Voss, who I'd heard of and respected. Simone herself looked different than she had at the party, composed on the surface, but something underneath the composure was moving around like water under ice. Derek Weston was not present. His attorney was, "I won't walk you through every detail of the board meeting because some of it is still in process, and my own attorney has advised appropriate discretion. But I'll tell you what the outcome was. Patricia and George voted to uphold the financial review and the temporary asset freeze. Simone's attempt to have them overturned failed. The board requested a full independent audit of the Chicago branch to be completed within 60 days. All discretionary spending was suspended pending the audit, and the share restructuring filing Simone had initiated was formally challenged and put on hold pending the financial investigation. Simone's attorney argued that these actions were retaliatory. Caroline Voss is good at her job, and she made a compelling case, but the documentation was what it was. You can't argue with a paper trail that forensic accountants have already traced to its source. When the meeting ended, Simone and I were in the hallway for 30 seconds alone, while our attorney spoke to the independent directors. It was the first time we'd been face to face since I'd walked out of that ballroom. She looked at me and said, "You didn't have to do it this way." I said, "You set the terms when you signed the shell company documents." She said, "I was going to talk to you." I said, "Simone, you told Derek things about me, private things. You let 400 people hear me called that in public, and you stood there and watched. I don't think talking was ever really part of your plan." She didn't have an answer for that. I walked back into the boardroom. Here's what happened to Derek Weston. The company terminated his employment the Monday after the party, effective immediately, on the grounds of financial misconduct pending investigation. His corporate email access was revoked. His company vehicle, which had been a perk of his project manager role, was collected by a leasing company on Tuesday. He hired an attorney and sent a letter claiming wrongful termination. Franklin's documentation went to the attorney within 48 hours. The letter was not followed up on. I heard through a mutual contact in the Chicago real estate world that Derek had moved out of the apartment he'd been renting in River North. I heard that Simone had been paying part of that rent through a vendor account. I heard that when that account was frozen, the landlord had started asking uncomfortable questions. I didn't look for that information. It came to me, which is how it usually works when you've run a company long enough and you know the right people. The divorce filing came 41 days after the party. I expected it earlier. Honestly, I think Simone and Caroline Voss were waiting to see how the financial picture would settle before they made their move. Smart tactically, but the financial picture wasn't settling in Simone's direction. And eventually, you have to move. She filed in Franklin County, Ohio. The filing listed irreconcilable differences, which is the legal way of saying, we both know exactly what happened, and we'd rather not put it in a document. Her attorney made an aggressive claim on her 30% equity stake and argued for valuation treatment that would have put her share at somewhere north of $40 million. David had anticipated this. We'd spent 3 weeks preparing our counterposition. The 30% stake was real, and it was hers, and I wasn't disputing that. But the financial misconduct documentation, the $4.22 million, the shell entities, the breach of fiduciary duty, all of it was now formally on record. In Ohio, financial misconduct by a shareholder can affect the settlement terms in a dissolution. It doesn't eliminate equity, but it changes the conversation significantly. It also meant that Simone faced potential civil liability separate from the divorce proceedings entirely. And if the audit concluded with findings that the forensic accountants had flagged, there was a referral to consider. Caroline Voss is a smart attorney. She knew what the audit was going to find. I think she talked to Simone, and I think Simone had a hard couple of days. The settlement we eventually reached took 4 months of negotiation. I'm not going to share the specific terms because some of them are confidential by agreement and because some details belong to me. What I will tell you is that it was fair, not generous on either side. Fair. David is a better lawyer than he is a storyteller, but he made sure every number reflected what the documentation showed. The Chicago branch is now under new management. I brought in an operations director named Angela Kwan, who came from a national freight company in Atlanta and who does not have any personal relationships with my ex-wife. The audit concluded, the findings were significant. 2 separate matters were referred out. I don't know what will happen with those referrals. That's not my case to run. 3 months after the divorce was finalized, I was in my Columbus office on a Tuesday morning reviewing the Q3 numbers when my assistant told me I had a visitor who didn't have an appointment. She said the woman told her it was personal and that she thought I'd want to hear what she had to say. I said to send her in. She was maybe 45, professionally dressed with the kind of direct eye contact that tells you a person is used to difficult conversations. She introduced herself as Patricia Walsh. She told me she was a partner at a firm that specialized in corporate ethics consulting, and she'd heard about what had happened with the Chicago branch. Not from me, from people in the industry who were aware of the audit's results. She said she'd been doing a parallel investigation into Derek Weston on behalf of a previous employer. She said she believed she had documentation that connected him to similar financial irregularities at a logistics firm in Denver 3 years before he joined Harav. She wanted to know if I'd be willing to cooperate in sharing information. I called David. David called her attorney. We had a formal meeting 2 weeks later. I don't know yet where that goes, but I'll tell you what I thought when she left my office that afternoon. I thought about a woman in a Cincinnati conference room 12 years ago asking me, what happens when you scale too fast and your infrastructure can't keep up? I gave her the best answer I had at the time. And then I spent the next 12 years learning that it wasn't good enough, that you can build the strongest structure in the world, and it can still fail you if the person you trusted inside it is quietly taking the walls apart. But here's the thing, structures can be rebuilt. I know how to do that. It's what I've always known how to do. There's one more thing I want to tell you before this ends. 3 weeks after the board meeting, I drove up to Dayton on a Sunday and took Robert Adler to breakfast. He picked the place, a diner on Salem Avenue that had apparently been serving the same breakfast menu since 1971. We had eggs and bad coffee and talked about the Bengals for 20 minutes, which is the only football team Robert has ever cared about with any real conviction. Then he said, I talked to Simone. I waited. I told her that whatever she thought she was doing, she had treated you badly, that regardless of what happened between the two of you, a man deserved better than what she let happen at that party. He looked at his coffee. She cried, which is something I didn't expect. Did she say anything? I asked. She said she'd been ashamed of herself since that night, that when she saw your face when you were walking out, something clarified for her that hadn't been clear before. I didn't say anything. I'm not asking you to forgive her, Robert said quickly. That's your business. I just wanted you to know that the woman I raised is still somewhere in there. She just made a long series of very wrong choices. He looked up at me. And so did I, probably for not asking harder questions when I should have. I told him he wasn't responsible for his daughter's decisions at 40 years old. He said, no, but I'm responsible for breakfast. He picked up the check before I could reach it. I sat in my car for a few minutes before driving back to Columbus. The diner windows were fogged at the edges from the warmth inside. I thought about what it means to go all in on a person, about what you're supposed to do when that choice turns out to be wrong. I don't have a clean answer to that. I'm not sure anyone does. What I know is that wrong choices made by other people are not the end of the story. They're a chapter, and chapters end. I'm 49 years old. I built a company from a single warehouse in Columbus, Ohio, into something worth $138 million. I made that happen through about 10,000 days of showing up, doing the work, and refusing to stay down when the ground shifted. That's still who I am. The number of people who get to define me fits in my hand. Robert Adler is one of them. My attorney, David, is another. My mother, who passed 3 years ago, Counts even though she's gone. My senior operations manager, a man named Curtis Wells, who has been with me for 11 years and who I trust without qualification. Derek Weston is not on that list, and as of 4 months ago, Simone Harov isn't either. What happened on the 34th floor of the Meridian Tower on North Michigan Avenue? The laughter, the words, the hand on my chest. The security guard walking toward me like I was a problem to be removed from a room I had financed was meant to be the ending, meant to be the moment I broke. It was actually the moment I started. 56 missed calls on a phone I didn't answer. That's not a man being destroyed. That's a man who already knew exactly what he was doing. You build something real by walking out of rooms that don't deserve your presence. You build something real by doing the work while other people are still celebrating. And you build something real by knowing deep in your gut that the people who laughed at you in that ballroom will eventually have to deal with what you built on the other side of your silence. My name is Bradley Hargrove. I went quietly, and then I went to work. It wasn't the humiliation in that ballroom. It wasn't even the betrayal. It was the 11 days. 11 days of sitting across from someone who was lying to his face and choosing not to react. Just watching, building, waiting. Most of us, myself included, would have exploded on day 2. But he understood something I think we all need to hear. The quietest response is sometimes the most powerful one. Not every battle needs to be loud to be won. Drop a comment below. Would you have been able to stay that quiet? Because honestly, I'm not sure I could. And if stories like this make you think, make sure you're subscribed.